Okay, so good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this PLSA Policy Insights webinar. My name is James Walsh. I'm Head of Membership Engagement here at the PLSA, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this session about the Mansion House reforms. Where do we stand now? These Policy Insight webinars aim to give our members some insight, as the name suggests, into the work our policy team has been doing, and they've been tremendously busy over the last few weeks responding to the raft of consultations that were launched in the Mansion House speech. And we'll aim to give you a good flavour of that today. The way we're going to do it is I'm going to be joined first by our Director of Policy and Advocacy, Nigel Peaple. Nigel's going to give an overview of the Mansion House consultations and a little flavour of what we've said back to the government about them. And then I'll invite you, the audience, to put some questions to Nigel. Questions in the Q&A box in the usual way, please, and comments in the chat. After Nigel, I'll be having a short conversation with Rachel Brothwood, who is Executive Director of the West Midlands Pension Fund. Rachel will give us a sense of the local government pension scheme aspects of all this, and also a little bit about the themes that reach across the whole of DB pensions as well. And again, we'll have questions to Rachel then, and then we'll hear from Lizzy Holliday, who is Director of Public Affairs and Policy at Now Pensions. Lizzy and I are going to talk about the DC aspects, more parts, helping people with retirement decisions, and again, opportunity for questions to Lizzy. And then we'll hear from my colleague, Katy, who's the PLSA's Parliamentary and Stakeholder Manager, about the political process, getting the manifestos ready, general election, and how the PLSA is trying to influence the party's policy making and thinking. So lots of opportunities here from our staff and our members, but also lots of opportunities for you, the audience, to put your questions in. With the opportunity to upvote, terrible verb, that's what I'm told it is, to upvote the questions you like best, so do that, and I'll try and pick the ones that are most popular. And before you ask, we will circulate the recording in 48 hours or so, and Nigel's couple of slides, and we'll put all that on our website as well. So enough intro from me. I'm going to turn over to Nigel. Good morning to you, Nigel. Good to have you with us, and you're going to give us an overview of the Mansion House reforms and consultations.
Yeah, thanks very much, James, and hello to everyone who's out there. I've got the, I believe, unenviable task of trying to cover off the enormous number of reforms and what the PLSA members think of them in about 6 or 7 minutes. But really, so my job is really just to help remind you of the joys that we've been going through over the summer and a little bit before that. So I've got just 2 slides, and if the team's ready to put up the first slide, that'll just help people focus. So in some ways, it did feel like all this stuff about pensions and growth dropped on us out of a clear blue sky, or perhaps a clear rainy sky back in the March budget. But of course, many of you on the call here will be aware this is actually something government and the industry has been looking at for about 5 years or so, the whole issue of patient capital. And as I mentioned there's been various initiatives on that, the patient capital review, the work of the Productive Finance Group, that led the previous Minister for Pensions to alter the charge cap a little bit for AE, DC schemes, and the introduction of value for money tests. And of course, the LGPS pooling with its legislation passing in 2015 and for it taking place over about the last 5 years. But nevertheless, it was in the March budget speech where we heard the government's declared determination to try and increase the amount of investment in the UK, and in particular in the potentially high growth sectors, but we also know rather high risk sectors. And he had aspirations to encourage the consolidation of DC schemes and indeed DB schemes and indeed LGPS schemes. So that's the context. As you can imagine, this is a matter of great importance to our sector. And so the PLSA produced a paper after discussing, having quite extensive discussions with our members on this back in June. And I just mentioned here a few of the points. We've been very clear. It's essential that the fiduciary duty is protected and that schemes are left with investment freedom to invest in the interests of their scheme members. We've been very clear about that, including early on in this year when it was clear that other parts of financial services industry was telling the government other things. We've also been trying to explain some of the confusion there's been in this space. What's wrong with the UK pensions? Why are they all investing abroad? Why are they all investing in bonds? And so we tried to kind of cast a little bit of light on that, but explaining some of the subtleties of our sector, and in particular, the difference between an open and a DB scheme and their investment time horizons, and getting into some of the issues facing DC schemes operating in the automatic enrolment market with a very downward strong pressure on charges, which does have implications over investment offerings. And we've also gone on to say, well, yes, consolidation can help schemes invest in a wider range of assets, including private equity, but it's not the answer in itself. And there are many ways of doing this anyway, without necessarily having scale. And indeed, it's far from sure that it's always the right thing to do, which obviously everybody on this call is aware of. But I did just want to say then the third element of our paper back in June was to emphasize there are things the government can do to make it easier for pension funds to invest in the UK. And there are issues there about regulation, in particular the TPR DB funding code, as it relates to open DB schemes. We believe there should be more flexibility in that. Fiscal incentives, one of the clear things that came out of talking to our members was that if you can alter the financial risk return benefit, then it makes assets more interesting. So fiscal incentives, such as the LIFTS initiative, is a possible way to go. And a thing that our members were very clear on is that there isn't really a pipeline of suitable investable assets. And it's interesting because I've asked some big corporates about that because they're saying we need more money. And they said, oh, and I said, well, what's going on? Our members are saying we can't see these assets worth investing in, and you're saying you can't get the money. What's going on? He did actually say to me, well, they'd given up asking, but I think we all know it's a little bit more complicated than that. And they have indeed, we've been exploring over the summer as I'll go on to the role the British Business Bank might be able to help, and indeed the private sector generally. And then finally, onto that Mansion House speech in July, final bit of my background is, we had two things happening. We had the Mansion House Compact, where a number of large DC schemes committed to seeking to invest around 5% of their assets in unlisted equities by 2030, provided it is in the interest of their members and without that being limited to the UK. So there was the one key element, and the other key element about the Mansion House speech was all the talk and all the intention around consolidation. And that, of course, is the backdrop to the more detailed set of consultations that came out over the following day, which I will now go through in my second slide of two. Okay, right. So lucky us. So there were 8 documents published, and they kind of fall into 2 clear categories. One was consultations that we and you as an industry had the pleasure of working on over the summer, and 3 other things at the bottom, which were responses to previous consultations declaring a way forward. And for now, and for the interest of everyone's sanity and timing, I'll focus on the top 5. And what I'll do is I'll very briefly just say roughly what it did, just as a reminder to you. And I will actually then briefly say what the PLSA membership has said about those things, which we've put in our responses to government. In most of the cases, we put in our responses to government last week, 5th of September. We're very lucky. It's very busy here in pensions world. Okay, so the first of those, options for DB. So that was all about, can there be things done for DB pension schemes to give them more flexibility in their investment options. It also explored about the various consolidation options there. And it also went on to say, what about changing the incentives affecting trustees in particular, but also scheme sponsors? Would it be useful to make it easier to return surplus while still ensuring that members' schemes are well protected? And in that consolidation piece I mentioned, there was 2 elements. There was the how do people feel about a public sector consolidator in general? Specifically, should the PPF be given this task? And I will just mention, they had also in their separate response to consultation said, we want to crack on with promoting DB super funds by giving them a primary legislative regime. So that was the question. Our members who took part in lots of surveys and roundtables and meetings over the summer with us basically said they would like to have lots of options when it comes to the DB funding and the DBM game. They're interested in buyout and buy-in. They're interested in having DB super funds in the mix. They're interested in using DB master trusts. They are interested as well in return of surplus, but only if we're sure it's going to protect member benefits, so they're not put at risk. But they weren't so keen on having the PPF as a public consolidator. They were particularly worried about it undermining its current role and the complexities there. If there was to be a public consolidator, and even if it was to be the PPF, then they were very clear it should be kept operationally completely separate from an existing entity, and also only to serve market failure, only to serve provide a security consolidation arrangement where these are not already available either from insurance or from a growing and future DB super fund world. So that's DB schemes. Okay, moving on. Pension trustee skills, capability and capacity. There was a focus on, it was of course focused on, is there something going on with trustees that is affecting their investment choices? But obviously it looked at things a bit more widely. So there were questions about their effectiveness. There were questions about the advice they receive. There were specific questions about there should be a register. Should trustees be accredited? What particular role might there be for professional trustees? And should there be an amendment to fiduciary duty? So in terms of our members' response to that, which we again sent off last week, the feeling was that actually lots of trustees are doing a crackingly good job, and if they're not investing in productive finance, as the government likes to call it, it's because it's not appropriate for the schemes in question. But there was a feeling that some trustees in smaller schemes don't have the same governance and support available for them, and so there probably is more to do in that space around raising standards. We think the TPR's got a job of work to do about improving the TKU, raising the standard, making it more accessible. And our members were keen on having a register for trustees. And the feeling was if you had a decent register of trustees, you could have a much more intelligent conversation about what are the needs of trustees, where are they falling short, what should be done about it. So that was a brief mention of the trustee skills one. Small pots. Right, so small pots, I hope you're all keeping up. Small pots. So there was a response to an early consultation and there were proposals going forward. I'll keep it very simple. The Minister and the government are keen to crack on with the proposed default consolidator approach as a solution to small pots. And they think there should be a small number of consolidators authorised. And as I think Lizzy will talk about later on, there was a feeling that the pot size should be about £1,000 and a pot be considered requiring defaulting and consolidation after about 12 months. I won't say more about the proposals there, other than to quickly go on to saying roughly what our members said in response. Now, our members are very, very keen that we find a solution for small pots. And we all understand it's a missing, broken bit of AE that needs addressing. So we're very keen actions taken. In terms of the default consolidator model, and I should say they're going down the multiple default consolidator model, our members felt there were pros and cons for that, as indeed there were at our For Pot Follows member. And so in many ways, you'll only really understand the impacts and how well it will all work once you've gone to the next stage of policy work and defining how everything fits together. And importantly, also the role of some kind of central clearinghouse or registry. That said, we are absolutely clear we are comfortable working to support the the default consolidator model, and we're keen to be helping the government solve that problem. And that's what our members think on that. Right. Now, I'm going to have a small breath here because the LGPS next steps on investment only have to do half of this because the deadlines that apply to this are slower. So whereas the other consultations are all due in 5th September, this one's due in early October, and we're actually in the middle of discussions with our members on this. But what I can tell you is the consultation was basically, where have I got my little head? The consultation was basically notes on wanting to go further and faster with the consolidation that's already underway. They would ideally like to see all the assets transferred from the 90 plus pension funds in England and Wales into the 8 asset pools by March 2025, which actually is a very tall order, but anyway. And they would ideally like to see the asset pools each being of about £50 billion plus. And once that's happened, they would like there to be consideration around whether it's right to have the 8 existing pools or whether there should be further consolidation. And then added to that was a new target of investing in private equity of about 10%, or going for 10%. Now that is just over double what the LGPS scheme already does in unlisted equity and private equity. There are a number of other things in there which I won't go through because I know Rachel will be covering that off in more detail. What I will say is, so we don't yet have a formal view. I will merely say at this point that our members are quite cautious about the practicality of trying to transfer all those funds by the deadline of March 2025. It's obviously very, very short, lots of due diligence to be done. So that perhaps is not surprising. As you would expect, they don't really think it's appropriate to have fixed targets over asset allocation set. I think it's much more important the fiduciary duty type is protected, investment freedom is protected. But as I say, not yet a final position. And nearly at the end, everyone, DC accumulation, helping savers understand their pension choices at retirement. So here, this is all about the government stepping in to make sure there's more support for people at retirement. They'd like to see a broad alignment of the services and products offered across the market to make things easier for people. They want schemes to consider whether CDC is an option there. And they're also considering whether value for money tests should be extended in this space. Importantly, the most important thing really is that they're putting a duty on trustees to provide a solution, either themselves or to partner with some other provider to be able to provide a good combined decumulation solution that meets members' needs. And basically, the PLSA view on this is that, we're very pleased that they've adopted this trustee duty concept. It's something that we've been talking about for a number of years. We gave it a name. It's a name that's hard to forget. GRIC, Guided Retirement Income Choices. Several people on the call I know had a big role in developing that work. But basically, it's quite in line with our concept that something must be done. That includes a duty for members. The only missing bit, though, really, is that we also think guidance and advice is an enormously important part of decumulation, and that's not being picked up. And I think Lizzy will be talking about that later on. So I hope that's given everyone a delightful refresher about everything that's been happening on the Mansion House reforms.
Well, thank you, Nigel. I feel both refreshed and slightly overwhelmed by the amount of material there. I mean, your team have been working very hard, I know, on all this over the summer. Could you just briefly give us a sense of how you've been involving our members in this work and getting their input?
Yeah. Okay, well, I mean, as I sort of referred to, James, so our members set our policy positions, and they also provide enormous amounts of technical input and knowledge, and I'm tempted to say wisdom from the experience of working in pensions for so long. So basically, over the summer, we had special roundtables. We did a member survey. We had special meetings of our policy committees, DB, DC, Master Trust, and the LGPS one. And we had a special meeting of the policy board, which everybody enjoyed coming along to during the summer period. So we've done a lot of that. In parallel with that, we've been hosting a whole load of meetings between the British Business Bank and our different membership groups to see whether there's something they could offer that meets the needs of our members. So basically, that's how we've been working with members. And then I'll just say one word. Prior to the summer, our focus was very much working with key stakeholder groups and with ministers and civil servants. But I won't say anything more about that because I expect everybody wants to get on to the next, to the Q&A and then to the other speakers.
Thanks very much, Nigel. We have got some questions starting to come in. Do keep putting them in the Q&A box. And we've got a couple, Nigel, about the sort of DB consolidator issue. Let's see, Henry Tapper is asking, what anonymous attendee was asking, how does a PLSA feel about super funds? And there's also a question about, I'm just trying to bring it up now. I think Henry put it in the chat. Does the PLSA support commercial consolidators? If so, what help is it giving super funds to take on occupational pension schemes? Maybe you could say a word about those issues around super funds.
Yeah, so as I alluded to, our members are keen on having all the options there, and therefore you won't be surprised to learn the PLSA is indeed supporting work on government proposals to do work on DB super funds, and we've done a lot of work with them over the last few years in what's the appropriate regime. And you, James, like me, have been around for a few years now, and so you will remember the work. The DB task force, where we kind of put a lot of these issues on the agenda about the pros and cons of consolidation, that there are many different options there. And some people on the call hopefully will remember the discussion of that. That did indeed get picked up by DWP. They're supporting it. It got delayed for a while as there were discussions within government about the appropriate regime. But we now have a minister who's very keen to crack on with that, and no doubt partly because they see a link in here to the broader set of investments that the government's so keen on.
Brilliant. Nigel, thanks very much. We're going to give you a moment to get your breath back now. Thank you. And I'm going to turn to Rachel Brothwood from West Midlands Pension Fund. Rachel's going to talk to us a little about the LGPS angles and themes across the rest of DB. Rachel, Nigel's already given a brief overview of the LGPS of the consultation, but maybe you can explain a bit more of the context for us and how you see what's been happening in the LGPS.
Absolutely. Thanks, James, and good morning, everybody. So as Nigel referred to, we have our own very special consultation in the LGPS, which is purely LGPS focused. It actually covers 5 different parts, including some tidying up on existing aspects of LGPS regulation. But broadly speaking, there's 2 areas of focus and discussion. One is around investment pooling, so the consolidation around how we implement investment strategy, which Nigel's referred to. And the other one is about the allocation of investments and investment strategy, focused on, yes, UK growth, but also on levelling up. Not a surprise, perhaps, when you think about our scheme manager and their remit. Across the sector, there's sort of 3 broad areas that I would say is common across the consultations and the various calls for evidence that have been released. Consolidation continues to be a huge theme, looking for value, looking for efficiency. Some call to revisit risk appetite, perhaps, consider investments that are more local and close to home. And also a common theme around the development of knowledge and skills and how we can improve and enhance that to build confidence in decision making.
Thanks, Rachel. And how do you think all this has been received? What have your LGPS colleagues been saying about it?
Yeah, so as you say, it's a live consultation at the minute, but there has been quite a bit of dialogue. The general mood is quite mixed. If I first talk to pooling, it very much depends on what individual funds and pools have as their vision for their pool and how bought in they are to perhaps some of the potential benefits. So there's some mixed views on pace. Arbitrary dates and fixed transition plans, I think we will probably all recognise, don't work really when we're living in perhaps such an uncertain and changeable environment. Moving on to the kind of investment strategy and asset allocation, like all parts of the industry, this starts to blur lines on roles and responsibilities and ask questions around fiduciary duty. And what's been observed really within the LGPS community is that within this consultation, and it probably happens across, is that there is an absence in acknowledgement on risk and who ultimately is accountable for that risk and responsible for managing it and delivering benefits over the long term. Probably just final point on that, we do recognise that and welcome really the shift away from a focus on cost. We've seen a lot of focus on cost and cost savings across the industry, but also predominantly in the LGPS and for pooling. And we're realising now that actually some realisation of good outcomes is very much linked to strategy and returns. So if that's a continuing theme, we welcome it.
Brilliant, Rachel. And pooling obviously has been a big part of this debate, this consultation. What's your take on pooling, Rachel? Do you think it's delivered good outcomes for the LGPS?
Yeah, I think that throughout the LGPS, I think people can point to benefits, and some of them are tangible and measured and reported around costs and cost savings. And I think what we've focused on more at West Midlands and others are similar, is that, you know, how can we really achieve the best outcome for our members over the long term? And what pooling's enabled us to do is build a more sophisticated operating model, which has better operational resilience, and it's enabled us to refocus our in-house expertise and ensure we've got the right expertise in the right place, both within the fund and the pool. So what that means in practice for us as a fund within the LGPS is that we've now got much more time allocated to investment strategy, asset allocation. We're integrating and spending a lot more time looking and thinking about how we integrate and develop our responsible investment, climate, investment and funding objectives to ensure we've got the toolkit we need to deliver the contribution profiles that are palatable to the employers in our fund.
And what about this whole pensions and growth question, Rachel? I mean, do you see the LGPS sort of playing a role in that, in UK growth?
Yeah, so I guess the easy answer to that is no more than any other part of the industry.
Yeah.
We all have the same fiduciary duty, and I think, you know, it's really important that we don't lose sight of that. But what we have to acknowledge is that we are potentially quite well placed to consider, you know, how could more capital be allocated within the UK and put to good use. We're open, we're long-term investors, and we have UK beneficiaries who will, you know, could benefit from some of the outcomes of perhaps aligning what we do with some of the ambitions of the levelling up missions. So we do believe there's opportunity for investment return from looking at UK innovation. The system needs to develop so it's more accessible, again, something Nigel referred to earlier. And what we found is, you know, if you can realise the sort of investment objectives and find a way to mitigate that risk, it's doable. But there's still a challenge for all of us on, is it the biggest priority for the pensions industry, the LGPS at this point in time?
Yeah. What about sort of skill set and expertise across the LGPS? Is that an issue, a barrier of any kind?
No, and I think, again, just going back to something I just talked about earlier around that, you know, you could read that, you know, the lack of trustee knowledge and skills is perhaps a reason for why we haven't invested in UK venture capital, and that really isn't the case. What does need to be acknowledged, though, is that these types of investments do require a different level of engagement and a skill set, both to undertake due diligence, explore and contribute to their design, and they're more complex to oversee. So really need to be clear about what it is that you're trying to do and the ambition you've got at the right size, so you can make sure that you've got the right governance budget, you've got the right resource, and however you're accessing that expertise, whether it's in-house or externally, you need to make sure that you do access it and you use it effectively. So, as we said earlier, typically large funds like ourselves are better able to respond to this, as is the case in wider DB.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, you are one of the largest LGPS funds, Rachel. What are you doing at West Midlands that others might find, you know, innovative or of interest, and not just other LGPS funds, but DB funds in general? What would you sort of highlight there that you've been working on?
Yes, I think if I look back over the past sort of decade at what the fund has done, and that's a little bit different and interesting, we have worked with partners in the region to develop and provide investment to support small business, housing, real estate infrastructure, and most recently we launched earlier this year a fund in partnership with the West Midlands Combined Authority that provides investment to small growth companies, including those developing clean tech, medical tech and advanced manufacturing. So it's all very aligned with the ambition that we share to support in energy transition in the region and develop jobs and skills for the future. So it is possible, and these things are really happening, but they're small scale.
And just one last question for me, Rachel, before we move on to Lizzy. We're hearing a lot of this debate about use of surplus in DB. Is that an issue at all in the LGPS? Is there any kind of discussion about that, or is it just totally different?
So the LGPS funding level has moved and improved, much like the rest of the sector. It's not actually part of the LGPS consultation funding, but clearly it's something that's, you know, close to our minds as well. We do operate in a slightly different environment, and again, you can't really take some of the headline figures at face value. Need to really recognise what reliance is built into the funding estimates, and recognise also that we're managing risk over quite a long time horizon, over quite a complex set of employer covenants. So yeah, every LGPS is in a slightly different place, a much better place than we were when in England and Wales we did the valuation 18 months ago. But what we do next, and particularly at employer level, will very much depend on balancing that, the different risks, investment funding and covenant over the long term.
Okay, and we've got a question come in from James Anderson. I'm not quite sure from the way his question's phrased if it's just directed at you and the LGPS, Rachel, or more widely across DB. I'll see what you make of it. He says, why does the industry feel that having a larger potential 8-pool funds with a third tier of asset managers of these funds that have to be paid for, rather than seriously looking at merging funds? Yeah, I see what he's getting at. What's your view on that?
Yeah, so I think you look at where you can maximise value. So the LGPS and its future has been something that's been debated for some time, and we don't have the challenge that perhaps others have, in that we do have a single benefit structure, but we have very different mixes of employers with very different time horizons and cash flows. And the governance arrangements and the responsibilities all really sit at a local level with the local administrative authorities and the local authorities that fundamentally back the LGPS funds. The reason why the pooling and the focus has been on investment strategy and consolidation and collaboration, really, in terms of how investment strategy is implemented, is because that was the area that there was the biggest potential for sharing ideas, for realising value, generating cost savings, and really doing more than we were able to do before. So yes, really just prioritisation, in my view.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. We've got quite a few questions coming in. Several of them are more about private sector DB, so we're going to sort of come back to those a little bit later. But thanks, Rachel. Let's bring Lizzy in to focus a bit more on some of the DC aspects of the Mansion House sort of programme. And let's focus particularly on small parts. Nigel mentioned it briefly. But Lizzy, you're involved in one of the largest mass trusts. You know, what's your perspective on where we've got to with the consultation on small parts, and how do you see it fitting into the pension and growth agenda?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of what we've got with the consultation, I guess there's one big decision about which model to take, which has created some big reactions, and we've got some big questions about it. And I think what we've also got is a lot more work to do. So I think the main thing we can take from the consultation is the big decision, which is the what model the government wants to pursue, and they've set that out as a multiple default consolidator. I think in terms of the proposals, they're more focused on the how to deliver that, what's the framework that's needed to support that model, and what other things need to be in place. But I think that the model itself has probably been significantly influenced by the pensions and growth agenda. I think the rationale that DWP set out is all about enabling scale to be built more quickly, enabling consolidation, and thereby seeing more opportunity for investment in illiquids. But I think interestingly as well, there's kind of this ongoing theme of consolidation, and how many different ways can we use the word consolidation across how many different topics, and both consolidation of the master trust and also consolidation of the DC landscape more generally. And they are also to feed the growth agenda. So we can see the fingerprints of the growth agenda, I think, across everything. I think also the what and the how have been influenced by this kind of, there's a couple of lines in the consultation document that talk about a future move to lifetime provider model. So that's something that sort of obviously gets everybody's attention, but there's not a lot of detail in the document. But I think we can see the influence of that ambition across some of the mechanisms that have been proposed in the document. And I think some of those how, you know, what is the how are we going to deliver it? So Nigel's outlined a few of those. So the consultation in particular sets out decisions about the small pot criteria, around the pot size being £1,000, the deferral period being 12 months. It specifies there'll be an authorisation process for consolidators. So you only get to be a consolidator if you pass the unspecified as yet authorisation process. And also that same scheme, so in-scheme consolidation, will only be required of consolidators. There's quite a few elements that were in the consultation but weren't in the call for evidence. And so I guess it kind of feels like there's more work to do on these and get underneath that stuff. So Some of the high level process sort of flows are in the consultation, but they're not complete yet. There's a lot of detail that's not there. There's proposals for a clearinghouse entity. That's a huge intervention as described in the document. And I think we need a lot more exploration of what's involved in that, whether it's necessary, whether the functions that it needs to fulfill are actually a consequence of a process that hasn't yet been consulted on. I think also the allocation of members to the consolidated process could do with a bit more discussion. I think that could be made slightly more efficient. And I think also they've added the additional objective in there as well, around consolidation, which I think it is, you know, the proposal is bearing a lot of weight now from a lot of different objectives. So I think that's all quite interesting what we've got in the actual document there.
Thanks, Lizzie. And maybe you could give us a bit more of your perspective on all this. And in asking you that, and perhaps I can bind in Craig Rimmer's question. Craig asks about the multiple default consolidator model. Do you think it's going to see the light of day? He says the legislative ask appears to be challenging in itself time-wise, and added to that is the complexity of building the architecture, which seems even more complex than dashboards. What's your view on that and the proposals in general?
Sure, yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, there is a challenge with building the framework that's needed, but I would say that, you know, the pot follows member solution isn't a complete solution as, you know, in terms of what's in the 2014 Act. That doesn't go through all of the process work that we now need to go through for the default consolidator model. And that's why I think it's so important that this consultation included a decision about what the model is, because we can spend an awful lot of time debating the pros and cons, and there is value for each of the proposals. There are challenges with each of the proposals. I think making a decision is a really strong step towards getting towards delivering the solution. And I think without that decision, we could spend a lot of time debating this. It's quite interesting debate, but it doesn't help our members if we don't move on with the decision. So I think that's why I welcome the decision. And we do, from Now Pensions, no one will be surprised to know that we do welcome the decision as a default consolidator model. We do think that helps our members. We do think it speaks to that kind of cohort that are most impacted by the small pots issue when you're looking at pots of around £1,000, and that the challenges and the solutions, you know, we can be there to help with that. So we think, you know, from our perspective, and I do appreciate there'll be lots of other perspectives, which, you know, makes the PLSA job particularly challenging. But, you know, from our perspective, we do welcome it. I think there's still, as I said, a lot of work to do, and, you know, including the things around the architecture that Craig has raised. We absolutely think and agree there's a lot of work to do, but we want to roll our sleeves up and get involved in sorting those things out and being part of the solution. We very much welcome DWP's commitment to a delivery group, which I accidentally keep calling a design group. I think that's a bit of a Freudian slip, but the delivery group I think is going to be essential. And I think the key thing for the delivery group at the moment is about making sure that its remit and its scope is wide enough, that it's going to have a real feed in to some of the decisions, including some of those things that are in proposals in the consultation. And we're quite keen that the delivery group gets to get involved in feeding in more views, discussing and having a discussion between people around that table as well, rather than just sort of isolated responses being written in per scheme. We think that's really important, and obviously looking to work closely with PLSA on that as well, bringing people together and discussing different views and arriving at a joint decision and a joint conclusion and position. I think in particular, some of the things we want covered are the clearinghouse and central registry. I think if we went back to looking at what a process could be, we could probably build something that's a little bit more efficient than what I can see in the consultation document at the moment. I think PLSA talk about a blended approach. I think we talk about, you know, what are the key things this clearinghouse is being asked to do, and are they all necessary, or could a different process answer those challenges in a different way? And we're very much with the latter. We think there's a more efficient way of doing it. Also think, yes, Craig, dashboard infrastructure, really complicated. Why don't we use it for this as well? We don't want to delay the dashboard, but I think there's something about using all of the learnings from that, using some of the infrastructure in due course in order to not build a second thing that does something a little bit the same, a little bit different, but actually joining these things up. I think other things around process for allocating and communicating with the member definitely need a little bit of attention. There's a lot more. There's many more options that could be taken into account in addition to the A and B that's in the document. We want to understand a bit more about why those aren't in the consultation We've put forward our own proposals about what we think they should be, and I'm sure other schemes have done the same as well. But we think all of these things need more data, more evidence, more working through. And until we had the decision about which model it was going to be, very difficult to explore all those things. You've got lots of layers, lots of scenarios to cater for. Now that we have the model, we can skinny that down and really focus. There are other things as well that aren't in the document that we really want taken into account and explored by the delivery group, and those things include the transfer process and costs, liability models, matching and unique identifiers, all of those kind of things.
Yeah, Lizzy, I'm just going to interrupt slightly there because I can see the clock ticking away, and I just want to move on and ask you to spend just 1 minute on the other major DC issue about helping people without retirement, decisions. Big consultation on that. I mean, what do you think the policy direction on that looks like now, and how do you see it matching up against what the PLSA has been talking about, that Nigel briefly mentioned, our model or our proposal for guided retirement income choices?
Sure, yeah. I think this is another one that is also heavily influenced by the illiquid agenda, and I think that's probably accounting for the timing of it coming out when it did. And I think we can see that in the reflection of a focus on product in that document, and as Nigel mentioned, the omission of the communications and governance aspects that were a key part of PLSA's GRIC. And I think in particular the focus on CDC as a product. We know the Minister has been talking about this for some time in terms of providing assurance of sustainable income, but I think there's also behind this is the illiquid agenda as well. I mean, I think we all recognise this ongoing tension between freedom and choice and the automatic enrolment inertia agenda, and that it does need fixing. So we welcome that DWP has now put this document out after July 2022's call for evidence. We do think the proposals align quite nicely, as Nigel mentioned, the overarching duty on trustees to support members in their decisions. And also being able to provide or signpost, so not just having to provide that from the scheme, but being able to offer that as through signposting, which I think DWP have made slightly more formal and called it partnering. But it means that there's options for different size schemes to be able to cater for this, which seems more appropriate. So I think that's really good. But again, we want to see more on those other essential elements. So member communication and governance. The real support for members is about making that choice, is about getting the member from accumulation into decumulation. The products are important, and being able to shape the supply side by having some kind of requirement, is probably quite helpful. But unless there's some way of supporting members through that choice process without it coming down to individual guidance and advice, which is not appropriate for all schemes, then you kind of really need this communications, including information, but also including choice architecture, and that's absolutely key. And we don't really see a lot of that in there. I think that's a missed opportunity, but we're really keen to work with DWP to kind of see how we can stitch those things together over the next short period. I think the other thing that we're really sort of keen and sort of, depending how you read the consultation paper, I mean, I guess our position, I think, is the same as PLSA's, which we don't agree with a hard opt-out default. So we don't agree that somebody should be put into a decumulation product without making a decision. So we very much support the idea of a single suggested, or potentially single, but a suggested option for the member that's presented to them that they can then opt into or not opt into, but they don't have to opt out. Things won't be done to them without their engagement at some level. And I think that provides that really helpful bridge between inertia and engagement.
Yeah. Thanks, Lizzy. Okay, lots to discuss there. I'm sure we're following up on all this with our members, but I want to thank you, Lizzy, and bring in, last but not least, my colleague Katy Little, looks after our parliamentary work. Just want to ask you, Kate, to give us your perspective on, what happens next with all this government policy making. When can it turn into actual policy decisions? Is that going to be in the autumn statement?
Yeah, absolutely. So welcome everyone. So for me, there are two very big events that are coming up that I will be keeping an eye on. And the first is the King's Speech. So the King's Speech is essentially where the government sets out its legislative agenda for the upcoming session. And this one will be particularly important because it will be the last one before the next general election. So that's due to take place on the 7th of November this year. A lot of the consultations that everyone has just been discussing will require some form of primary legislation. So it'll be interesting to see whether there will be potentially a pensions bill squeezed through before the next general election. And I do say squeeze because the next GE will be has to be called before January 25. So that leaves you about a year's worth of time to try and get a bill through, which is not a lot of time in parliamentary world. The other event that, as you mentioned, James, that's worth keeping an eye on will be the autumn statement. So that is now scheduled for the 22nd of November. It essentially allows the government to update on its economic plans for the year, taking into account the latest forecast from OBR. We know that post-Mansion's House, that pensions is very important to the growth conversation. So I'd expect a little bit more clarity on where some of those consultations end up post-November.
Okay, thanks, Katie. And you mentioned squeezing. We have squeezed a lot of material into this session this morning. I'm going to take a couple of extra minutes, though, Katie, because I've got a couple more points to put to you. Where the parties at now, do you think, in their manifesto planning, and how do we as a PLSA get our view into that process?
Yeah, so I would expect most of the political parties to have a pretty good idea of what some of their key messages will be ahead of the next general election. In terms of processes, I'll start with Labour first. So their manifesto is a very consultative one. It's led by their National Policy Forum. So they would have consulted their grassroots members. And in fact, way back in March, they held a consultation where they asked for wider stakeholder input. So the PLSA responded to that consultation when it was launched. On top of that, we've also been having conversations with the shadow teams as well. So as many of you will know that we had a bit of a Labour reshuffle last week. So now we have a new Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, which is Liz Kendall, and also a new Shadow Pensions Minister, which is Jill Furness. So we've reached out to those two new faces and hopefully we'll be having conversations with them very shortly. And then moving on to the Conservative manifesto process, it's almost the complete opposite. So it's very, very highly centralised, happens behind locked doors at CCHQ. So some of the engagement that Nigel mentioned in terms of, our engagement with ministers and SPADs and some of those really big wigs will be absolutely essential in terms of trying to get key messages across. I would also just want to point out as well that I would expect to see a little bit more of a flavour of what some of the manifestos contain at this year's party conference season, which is just around the corner.
Yeah, and I can just see there's a question from Patricia Hay Justice, and given the general election drawing ever nearer, isn't it prudent to liaise with both major parties? I think it's very clear from what you've been saying, Katie. We're absolutely doing that, and Patricia's spot on, of course, with her question. But what about the party conferences, Katie? I mean, you're going to be involved in all those, I think. Is that right? And what are we doing?
We will be attending all three, so Lib Dem, Labour and Conservative, and we will be hosting roundtables at two, so Labour and Conservative, and we're going to be talking about the pensions and growth at those roundtables, unsurprisingly, because it's such a hot topic. It's not just a government issue. It's really important to realise that, Rachel Reeves has also come out and said that she would, publicly back a growth fund. So Nigel, members from our board on our policy board will be attending those roundtables happening very shortly.
Katie, thanks very much. I can see you're going to be very busy. Well, we are over time, so we are going to draw towards a close. I just want to thank all our speakers and also my colleagues behind the scenes who've made this happen this morning. I just want to say a word about future events. We've got our PLSA annual conference coming up in just a few weeks' time in Manchester on the 17th to the 19th of October. And I think there's a slide there that mentions that, and also all the other things we're doing as well. We've got a Master Trust Forum just a few days' time on the 19th for our Master Trust members, our trustee training courses, and our DB Forum for our DB colleagues and members on the 15th of November. All those are available to book on our website, or just contact us if you've got questions. There were a lot more questions came in we weren't able to answer, so we'll have a good look at those straight after this, and I will do my best to ensure we circulate answers to those together with the other materials, the slides and the recording that will come round to you. But thanks everyone for dialing in. It's been a bit of a packed webinar this morning. I hope you found it useful. Do let us have any feedback. And thanks again to everyone who's been presenting and making it happen. Enjoy the rest of the day, everyone. Goodbye.